All right, well, thanks for joining me here after lunch. I know that can always be a difficult thing to do. My name's Jeremy Palenchar. I'm a founding partner, CTO, and head pitmaster at Orcas Consulting. We're based in, you can ask Andreas, how well the head pitmaster duties go. We're based in Seattle, Washington, and my email address is right here at the beginning of the presentation. One of the things that I like to do when I do these sessions at this conference and at the DEC conferences in the past is, as Gil did, really encourage you to reach out to the folks who are speaking, reach out to the other attendees, interact with us during the session breaks, in the evening events, and also as you go back to your organization and you start to think about how to really implement what we've talked about, feel free to reach out to us on email and get some clarifying questions and follow up and really learn about that. So anybody who's here because you heard that I'm an Active Directory expert and I might help you implement a customer-facing domain, I'm going to suggest that this might not be the talk that you're looking for and you can head across the hall. Anybody here who thinks that we might be talking about how to teach FIM or MIM or ILM, how to change a user's password using your Cisco IVR, this might not be the session that you're looking for, but I do have those slides so I can provide them to you later. And anybody here who really heard that in the past I've presented a lot of code, done a lot of really in-depth demos. This is also, unfortunately, not the session for you. And then finally, anybody who's here because they think that I'm going to put cute little haiku into my session, Joe did a very good job of that, so please get a copy of his slides. No, what I really want to talk about with you today is something that I've had a lot of conversations with my larger customers about in the last couple of years, something that I have conversations with my colleagues about, the other people in the industry who are really focused on doing identity management and global cybersecurity, right? And that's really, I can't stand there. How do we strike a balance between centralized identity management and directory services, those things that we've kind of all built and done and been experts in for the last 10 or 15 years or so? How do we strike a balance between that centralized identity management system and platform and more decentralized solutions as we move into this hybrid cloud identity model, right? We, as the practitioners of these solutions, as the owners of those solutions, tend to try to keep a lot of control. We want to keep our arms around these systems and solutions. Our customers, however, they're adopting brand new business models, brand new ways of delivering services. They're all about DevOps, they're all about SaaS, they're all about PaaS, they're all about taking somebody who's never written a line of code before and deploying an application to the internet in a week or two's time and making that a line of business or enterprise service or application. So how do we as those practitioners sort of adapt and strike a balance between that centralized control that we're used to and that we kind of lean towards more decentralized models? And what I'd like to do and what I've kind of highlighted here is, first of all, let's think about why, right? So start with why. I kind of mention that because the vice president of global cybersecurity that I work for right now did an entire presentation a couple weeks ago about a TED Talk that he had attended called Start With Why. And his feeling is that we as security practitioners can really think about and adopt that start with why and come up with better ways of evangelizing and discussing with our customers what we do. So if that's at all interesting to you, I suggest you can check out on tedtalk.com or whatnot the presentation by Simon Sinek called Start With Why. So we think about why we do the things that we do, why we build the things that we build. Next, I'd like to start to think about how we do it, right? How do we achieve the goals that we want to achieve? How do we deliver the services that we want to deliver? And then finally, to the end, who ultimately does that, right? And that's that balance that I'm trying to start to get you to think about or to understand is traditionally that was us as identity or security or data security. But now in these decentralized models, how do we achieve the same controls and the same objectives, but maybe the individual team does that or a line of business provides those controls and functions. So what sorts of tools and solutions do we need to implement to support them as they do? So first of all, let's talk about identity stores, right? So we have traditional centralized identity stores. We can have our authoritative sources for identity data, the HR system. One of the things I'm going to talk about is really having to, one of the tools in our toolbox should be an authoritative source for vendor and contractor information, right? Without that, we can't do identity lifecycle. We can't support a lot of the use cases that we need to support today. We have our Active Directory or our Enterprise Directory as a publishing point and as a store for identity data. I told the Google guy who just, I guess, decided to go to the other session that I was going to mention G Suite and the Google directory in my talk. You know, every customer that I've worked for in the last 5 years or so has had a Google directory implementation, right? So we're not only talking about Active Directory anymore. We're not only talking about Azure Active Directory anymore. We're also talking about Google Directory. We're talking about these other cloud directories and identity providers like PingOne, like Okta. And then something that I'm going to encourage all of you to build, right? And we'll talk about why. One of the things I'm going to talk to you, I'd like you to encourage you to build is an identity data warehouse, right? So this is really a place to publish your meta directory, the place to publish in a non-Active Directory way all the identity data that you have. And it may be that you publish it through LDAP and you don't do like a SQL implementation or you don't do sort of a REST interface to it or whatnot. But as we think about decentralizing identity management and allowing people to subscribe to identity data, I really think it's important to set up a place to do this pub-sub type of thing, and the identity data warehouse is really the place to do that. So a place where we can publish data out to our customers. And then identity stores, we've always had applications have their own siloed version of the user identity, right? Whether that's manually added and created or whether it's somehow synchronized or sucked out of our official systems. And now we also have these sort of external identities, right? So we have B2B relationships with organizations. We have social identities, so we can enable services like bring your own identity. And then we have the single-use directories, like, hey, you want to do single sign-on to your Oracle database? Guess what? The only supported way to do that is to stand up OID and OAM for Oracle, right? So now we have to create a directory that we might not otherwise need, but because of the restrictions or the limitations of the application, we have to support that, right? And I'm going to absolutely encourage everyone to raise their hand and interrupt me and ask questions as we go through. I think there's plenty of time in the talk to have that conversation. either as I'm presenting or at the end. So any questions so far? Nobody got up when I said I'm not talking about Active Directory in a customer-facing role, so that's good. So synchronization and provisioning. So this is sort of an area that's very near and dear to my heart as a MIM, FIM, ILM, MIIS implementer for very, very many years. So we have what I consider to be traditional enterprise identity management. So directory synchronization, account provisioning, password synchronization, and self-service. And then extending that into the cloud, right? So taking that either to Azure Active Directory or to Google Directory or to Okta to be able to sort of cloud enable that centralized identity that traditional enterprise identity management. And then obviously we have products from these cloud providers. So Microsoft provides the AAD Connect to bring your identities from on-prem to the cloud. Google, still not here to hear the call out. Google has their GADS product, right, that sort of does that same function, allows you to connect the Google directory to your Active Directory to synchronize those identities. So now we start to think about where my customers are coming to me and saying, we don't have the budget. We don't have the mandate from the organization. We don't have the headcount or the resources to sort of enable all of the applications in our enterprise with that traditional centralized identity management, synchronization, and provisioning platform. So how can we sort of support these use cases without having to build and grow that centralized organization? So we can think about taking the identity and the data that we have in our metaverse or in our identity warehouse and setting it up for pub sub, right? So we can say every time we add, change, or delete an identity within our data warehouse, we're going to send a message on the enterprise service bus, right? So the organizations I'm working with, they all have spent billions of dollars on these ESB systems. Well, we can publish that message and then downstream applications can subscribe to those messages and do their identity management. In certain cases that I'll talk about later, we can do things like SAML, SSO, just-in-time provisioning, right? So the user does an SSO function or action, and then the application can just take the attributes that were provided during the authentication or the authentication and provision a user into that application on the fly, right? So in certain circumstances, I think that that's a great solution. Although when you think about things like licensing costs and you think about sort of GDPR type, not GDPR, but risk and compliance issues, we might need to have that sort of two-way confirmation. Hey, this user visited your application and we provisioned them just in time, but we also need to be able to send you a signal that user's left the organization, we want to recall that license, etc. Right, so a lot of things that I'm seeing now are sort of the, hey, we've bought this line of business app and we have a script, and that script's just going to take all the data out of AD and copy it into our app and provision the users. And again, assuming that that application is using a good set of standardized attributes, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. It can kind of support this decentralized model, but it might not be appropriate for every use case, particularly when we're talking about applications with higher licensing costs, or we're talking about applications that have compliance controls or higher risk data stored in them. So things that I'd like to get folks to, think about sunsetting or deprovisioning or really trying to either discourage or even create policies against would be more of the manual application provisioning, or send a spreadsheet via secure FTP, right? So that manual app provisioning, while interesting and has been done for hundreds of years, isn't the scalable solutions that we might be necessarily looking for. And then that sending of the secure FTP from a strictly selfish perspective as an identity management sort of resource, we don't want to support all of the infrastructure necessary to support that FTP, right? So not only is it not a great idea for security and risk reasons, it's also a bad idea because from an identity management perspective, we have to do a lot of additional things. Was the file generated? Was it put in the right location? Was it picked up? Did they process it? Did they receive any errors? So there's a lot of additional operational overhead that's associated with that process. Above and beyond, it's just not a great security practice, right? So, any questions? I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. So, authentication. So, I'm going to do this decentralized authentication first, just to switch it up a little bit. So, in the decentralized authentication side, we've sort of got this federated SSO situation. We've got the ability to bring your own identity from a social identity provider. And we've got this application-based authentication. And so I think one of the most successful things that I've seen in terms of enabling this hybrid identity solution and sort of bringing identity and access management to the next level is, again, either strongly discouraging or creating enterprise policy against application-based auth, right? So as a very minimum, even if they do their own user account provisioning, even if all the authorization decisions are made within the application, which happens quite a lot, right? At least if they're using a centralized authentication provider, whether that be AD, LDAP, or some SSO solution, when we terminate that user, they no longer have access to the application. We might not recover the license that's out there, and there might be some straggling data running around that application in the future, but at least we've made sure that that user can no longer log into that application. And then over on the centralized side, sort of the standard AD, LDAP, federated SSO in the enterprise SSO, the ability to bring cloud directories and identities back on-prem, right? So if we have a Azure Active Directory where we've synchronized all of our users and all of our accounts, we can use those identities and provide a centralized authentication function. And then one thing that I've kind of put across the bottom here is the idea of providing strong auth for higher risk applications. I just did a talk over the summer at the Ping Identity Conference about MFA 2.0, right? So MFA 1.0, in my mind, is sort of what we have today, which is I have an application, I'm going to email you a one-time password, or I have an application and I'm going to send you a one-time password in SMS. And in my mind, that's not really sufficient today in the current environment. So really start thinking about not only having strong auth, but also having MFA 2.0, right? Some kind of secure second factor, whether it be a Ubico key, as Pam talked about this morning, or some other cryptographic-based token and authenticator above and beyond sort of that SMS text message that we've been relying on for so long. So thinking about authorization on the decentralized side, right? So in a decentralized way, we can encourage our app owners and our service providers to use attributes or claims that are based in a federated identity. We can think about SaaS invitations. So this is an area that I think a lot of my customers are struggling with right now. Let's do B2B in Azure AD, or let's invite guests with social identities to our Azure Active Directory. The problem with that, right, is that those invitations really create a shadow account in that directory. It's really a service principal in your directory that points to whatever identity provider they came from. If you're going to do that, and I'm not saying that it's a good idea or a bad idea, I think it's an excellent service that they provide. But if you're going to do that, you need to have some sort of review and attestation process in place to review those service principals that have been invited to your Azure Active Directory to make sure that they're still valid and provide a way to clean them up, right? So when we think about ourselves as identity providers and directory services providers, one of the core concepts should be any process that's in place to create or add objects to our directory needs to also have a compensating process or procedure to remove that object from the directory. Otherwise, as Joe mentioned in his last conversation about machine accounts in Azure AD, they just grow and grow and grow and nobody ever cleans them up, right?
So do you find the solution in Azure AD good enough for that?
The solution in Azure AD for cleaning up the
B2B accounts?
I haven't heard of one, Andreas. Why don't you share? Why don't you share with us what you know?
I'm just interested because I have the same problem with my customers. Yes, it's very easy to add business accounts.
Oh, it's way too easy. It's way too easy.
And I don't have a good process for myself. Okay, how am I supposed to remove them then? And how do you know why it was added?
Right. So how to remove them, I think, is fairly straightforward. How,
Well, you can delete the account. That's
right. Exactly. So I think what we really need is a more managed way to onboard them that allows us to provide more metadata about that object. And then once we have more metadata about that object, then we can make better decisions about when to delete them or who should delete them, et cetera. So I agree. And I'm glad to hear that I'm not behind the times, right? I thought maybe you had heard something interesting.
I was actually curious because I'm hearing the same from my customers as well. Have you found something I haven't?
Not yet. Absolutely not. So, and you'll see down the road when we talk about certain use cases and scenarios, I'm going to discourage the use of that process because there isn't a good way to clean them up that I'm aware of, right? So I think in certain circumstances it's okay, but again, it's very hard to manage. And then obviously we have a lot of in-app authorization, and I think that this is sort of the standard rather than the exception, right? The standard is user authenticates, maybe we use an AD group or we use an AD group claim from our SSO provider to give some high-level access to the application. But when it really comes to what can the user do in the app, that's almost always handled within the application. This user is in this department, this user has this role, et cetera, et cetera. And I haven't seen the app developers at all moving towards being able to accept those in claims. So I think that's just something that we have to accept. But if we combine this decentralized authorization with the centralized authentication, at least we know that when the user has left or no longer has a relationship with our organization, we can turn off their access regardless of what they were authorized to do. So I'm not going to talk necessarily about the centralized authorization pieces. I think we're all pretty familiar with how those work. I will say, and it was interesting that Joe talked about network and location-based conditional access during his talk, because this is something that I think we should start to avoid, right? Traditionally, we've always had this idea. You're on the network, you're in the building, somehow you're more secure or trusted than the guy who's off the network or out of the building or the guys in EMEA are less trusted than the guys in North America. And as we know, and as we've learned, figuring out if you're in the building or on the network or in EMEA or in North America is very hard to do and is often not, we come up with erroneous results. So I think we should start to stop thinking about things that way. And it will actually simplify our access policies, and it'll simplify sort of the rules that we make about who can do what and when, because we're not relying on this error-prone thing that we can't really test anyway. But again, we're treating more users the same, so we have less policies, I think. Any questions before I move on? All right, so let's talk about audit. So this is another area that I think as an identity and access management person, maybe I didn't think so much about in the past, right? So we always said, yeah, we can audit what happens in AD, and yes, we have some good ways to audit what happens in FIM or MIM or ILM or MIIS or whatever it is we want to call it. But above and beyond that, never really thinking so much about this. And when we think about decentralizing and sort of enabling more agile development processes and applications, I really think that audit starts to become the piece that pulls everything together, right? Because I can say, I'm going to leave the provisioning of the user to the application developer based on my published identity data, of course. I can leave it to them, assuming that the provisioning, deprovisioning, authorization, and authentication that occurs within that application is reported back to a centralized audit point, right? And this comes with the idea that I've sort of started to see as a basis in a lot of REST-based applications and a lot of web service-based applications is this correlation ID, right? So as an identity provider, I can emit a message on the service bus or through my pub sub or whatever it is that says, we've hired so-and-so user, et cetera, and in that message, I can put a correlation ID, right? And then one of my downstream application providers can pick up that message and they can say, great, I've picked up that user and I've looked at the attributes and they're in a department that I'm not interested in. So I took no action, right? So they could actually receive that message, put an audit event, and it was interesting that Pam mentioned earlier this whole SEC event standard that's coming out. I think I'm going to become very interested in what that is all about. But that application can consume my message, say, I've processed it, I've determined to take no action because it's in a department or a user class or job code that I'm not interested in, and then they can tag it with my correlation ID, right? And then another application receives the same message on the service bus pub sub and says, I've received your message. It is a department or a job code that I'm interested in. I'm going to create a new user with a role of user and whatever, and put that correlation ID on that message. Same thing happens for transfers, name updates, and then finally at the end of the user life cycle, we can send a message saying this user is no longer our partner, we're no longer interested in providing access to them. And by having both our identity platform and our application platforms sending audit messages to a centralized place using a correlation ID, it becomes much easier from a regulatory and compliance perspective to start answering those questions that we all struggle with, which is in a decentralized SaaS environment where we're using agile development and DevOps, and people are creating interesting mashups all over the place. How do we still provide that question that I always get asked, which is, who has access to this application, right? Who made this change to this object, right? I think that this idea of decentralized synchronization and provisioning combined with audit and correlation IDs can start to answer that question. Go ahead.
Where does the correlation ID come from? What is that?
So whoever initiates the process would just generate a GUID that says the correlation ID for this action is J123456, right? And then every actor down the road who picks that up can tag their action or activity or their message with that same correlation ID. So now if I go and I just put Splunk in here, because I don't know about you guys, but all my customers are using Splunk, right? So, you know, we have some what do they call it, filter or index in Splunk for sec event. So let's just say, I can say, well, I know in identity management, I issued a create thing with this correlation ID. I can hit enter and then pull up all of the downstream apps that took action on that and see, did they do the right thing or not? So I think that this, even though I've sort of ignored it in the past or not paid attention in the past, really starts to facilitate some of these new challenges that we're facing as we think about more of a decentralized identity and access management environment. Any other questions?
So your idea is that with the decentralized applications, you still have centralized auditing.
Right. So in summary, Andreas, I think what I've said is I'm okay with decentralized synchronization and provisioning, and we'll talk about cases where I don't think that that's okay. And I think that I'm good with decentralized identity stores to a good extent. But I think we should really enforce centralized authentication, right? Because that allows us to immediately terminate access when the user's left, regardless of whether the downstream application is paying attention or did the right action or whatnot. And I think that if we have a centralized audit with correlation ID, I think that we can start to do a better job of answering that, who has access to the application, who made the change to the identity. There was an interesting thing that happened 5 or 6 years ago where Microsoft tried to build sort of an authorization store in MSIT, where they would basically look at all your attributes and all your departments and who you worked on and what projects you were on, and be able to emit very fine-grained authorization messages and like inject them in your SSO claim, things like that. And my understanding from the engineers who were on it, the number of authorizations and the number of claims that had to be issued to do that authorization just became overwhelming and unmanageable and not very scalable. So again, I think that we have this idea or this concept of authorizations being decentralized and made in the application layer, but having that centralized audit and having that centralized correlation ID can start to help us bring that all back together and answer those questions, right? We can tell you what AD groups people are in, that's easy. We've been doing that for a long time. But if we think about this application that's AD integrated and you say, great, the user may have a group membership that's associated with it, but we really have no idea what the application has been, how the application has been configured to consume that group or take action on that group membership, right?
Do you see applications actually doing this to get this centralized audit right? Now you have to take the calculation for the 100 different application nodes and say, hey, the application application owner, now we need to change our application.
So what I'm starting to see is a lot of the web services based, sort of microservices based applications are almost exclusively going this way, right? And I think that for legacy applications or more non-traditional applications, or traditional applications, that it can be, even if we don't have the ability to insert a correlation ID in the log message, at least we can say this application has an audit log and it goes to this file, or this application has an audit log and it goes to this Windows Server event log, and Splunk can grab that data, pick it up. If it's not keying off the correlation ID, then at least it's keying off the username, or it's keying off some other key identifying information. But when it comes to this whole DevOps, REST-based, microservices, blockchain, I said blockchain, so I get 2 points for that, blockchain app that's being developed, I'm almost exclusively seeing this centralized audit with correlation ID. And I think probably even as you were leaving Microsoft and being involved in a lot of Microsoft services, I think you've seen the same kind of thing, right? Is this correlation ID that you can use to trace an event through multiple hops of a web service. Any other questions? Let's see. All right, so I kind of touched on each one of these, I think maybe a little bit. I'm going to try to bring this back together and think about the tools in my toolbox that I want to have in order to solve these kinds of problems, right? So authoritative sources are key. Being able to have an authoritative entry to say that this contractor starts January 1st and ends June 30th is key. If we don't have that information, we can't make any further decisions. We can't implement any of the solutions that I'm talking about. So I think first and foremost, make sure there's that authoritative source. HR is good about employees. Somebody needs to take ownership for all the others. Without it, I think we're driving a bus with no brakes, which might be good in South America, but not good for me. I don't know. This identity data warehouse as a repository of standardized attributes. This is a kind of a conversation that I have with some of my customers on a regular basis. We're going to let the application do their own provisioning, right? They have a script that they can run to read in a file or a directory or a whatever, a SQL table, whatever it is, and create the users in that application and update their data when it changes. Great. We don't need to write a FIM connector for every one of those applications. We don't have to build a SCIM interface to each one of those applications unless it really makes sense to do so from a centralized way. But having a standard set of attributes that all applications are using to do their own provisioning, I think is key, right? So if my name is Jeremy Palenchar and my nickname is Jim, right? In every application in the enterprise, I want my name to be Jeremy Palenchar and I want my name to be Jim. And our organization may standardize on 2 or 3 different flavors of that name. You know, Jim Palenchar, Palenchar, comma, Jim in the IT department, whatever it, you know, legal full name might be Jeremy Palenchar, I don't know. So we might have several different versions of that name, but what we don't want is we don't want each application owner out there coming up with their own name format or picking their own attribute to use for the name. The reason is because at some point I'm going to get married and I'm going to change my last name, right? And when I change my last name in the authoritative source, I want all the downstream applications to take that name change and follow the proper naming rules and change my name in the application. And if I don't do that, right, if I don't do that, then poor Jeremy, when he gets married, will change his name in HR, and then 5 line of business apps are going to have the wrong name, or they're going to have the name in the wrong format, right? So if we're going to decentralize identity management and synchronization and provisioning, I think that this idea of having a way to publish a standard set of attributes to all applications is one of those key tools, right? So if the standard format for cost center is a 10-digit number, and we're only on 7,500, right? Then everybody's cost center should be 000007500, right? If we allow the application to truncate those leading zeros when they store that cost center, then guess what? All of a sudden, when we do a federated single sign-on to that and we pass a cost center and they go to do a lookup, it's not going to work, right? So I'm kind of, I don't know, beating a dead horse here and kind of pushing to a real specific point. But I think that if we are going to enable this and do it successfully, we need to agree within our organization or within our customer organization, what are these standard formats for attributes, and how are we going to publish them in a way that the centralized and decentralized authentication, synchronization, and provisioning systems all have the same value or copy of that attribute, if that makes sense.
Would that be your Active Directory?
It could be, right? So we can think about multiple publishing points, right? So I believe that, we have a great publishing point in Active Directory. We have a great publishing point in Azure Active Directory or Google Directory, assuming that we set up the synchronization properly and we're getting all the attributes and values out there. I think that there's value in having a database version of that directory. It enables us to do better, easier, cheaper, faster things like data transformations or doing that publish to certain applications that might be database based without having to go through another tool. But you could certainly do it with only Active Directory, or you could certainly do it with only Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, right? But in almost every enterprise implementation of identity and access management, I've set up a SQL version of that data warehouse as a way to do things like auditing and reporting and publication of attributes to downstream systems as well. So while I don't think that it's absolutely necessary, I would say that I've never done a big implementation without it.
And what are you doing? Using like a CISSP package to pull the directory?
No, I got a management agent in FIM that just pushes all my metaverse data out to the SQL server. So I have a SQL MA hooked up to FIM. So every time an attribute changes in the metaverse, we just push it out to SQL. And then we use something like CDC or some other technique to track changes and then notify downstream customers that those changes have occurred. But if you didn't have FIM or MIM, right, then you could certainly, there's great examples on the internet of how to use the DirSync control in AD to just ask Active Directory for all the changes, right? So 100 lines of PowerShell or so, I believe you could implement FIM. Right, Andreas? In about 100 lines of PowerShell, you can implement FIM?
Yeah, almost.
Right, so without it, I think you could do it, but historically, that's what we've done. And by the way, there's a great new generic database connector for MIM that you should look at if you're trying to do database work with MIM. What do I want to talk about? So I've been working on Graph API and SCIM and things of that nature when we think about how do we, is he right? Do I really only have 10? He's right, I only have 10 minutes. How do we manage cloud identity, right? And I think that there's a good argument for investing in one of those platforms or technologies, whether it's push all your objects to Azure AD and then use some of their built-in application provisioning through SCIM interfaces, or write your own SCIM provisioning tool to manage cloud identities, or whatever it is that you do. I think that when we think about this hybrid identity problem, I think that being able to do a centralized management of cloud identity and applications is very important, because there are cloud applications that have high licensing costs and have high risk when it comes to compliance and enterprise data risk. And I think having full lifecycle identity management for cloud services and identities is important. So maybe not the first thing that you build, but I think that it's something that you're going to need. We already talked about why I really like a centralized audit system with correlation ID, so I'm not going to dig into that. So to kind of wrap this up and bring things together, I want to talk about a couple different scenarios and what you might do to solve these problems, right? So I've got an on-prem application with what I'm calling low impact. And low impact is something that you are going to define either for yourself or for your customer or within your organization. But to me, I'm going to define low impact as it's a line of business application. It might not be enterprise-wide. It's got a low license cost, so if I don't recover that license when the user leaves, I'm not hemorrhaging cash, as one of my customers likes to say. And the GRC impact is relatively low, right? If we don't I worked for an energy company. They're regulated by NERC-CIP, right? NERC-CIP says that if you have a privileged user who leaves the organization, you must disable their access to all NERC-CIP systems within 48 hours, or you have to self-report a violation of NERC-CIP and pay a $40,000 fine per incident, right? So that's NERC-CIP. That's the energy critical infrastructure, so that would be any power transmission, nuclear facilities, etc. So if we're talking about NERC-CIP application, high GRC impact for not doing things, we are not going to use decentralized provisioning, etc., etc. Make sense? So this is all pretty standard, low impact, on-prem. The app can do their own authorization decisions. We can use decentralized provisioning. We're still going to use that centralized authentication and centralized audit because I think it's key. This is kind of what we've been doing for a long time, right? Now, we go to a medium impact application. So we have a high license cost that we want to recover right away, or we have a higher GRC impact to the organization. What are we going to do? Well, we might invest in centralized provisioning and synchronization. We're going to require an automated account access review process, right? So we might not do that review as an IT organization or as an identity or security organization, but we're going to at least require that the application owner do some kind of an access review on a regular basis. And then we're also going to probably require some strong auth MFA 2.0, right? So let's talk about an on-premises high impact application. So we have a high license cost or GRC impact. This is my NERC-CIP customer. We're going to require automated account access review, and we're going to avoid, or if we can, possibly can, we're going to prohibit or create policy against app-based auth. And we're going to require centralized provisioning, right? So in this case, we're going to build that FIM connector. We're going to centrally manage that identity. We want to recover those licenses. We want to make sure that we don't have an audit point or a compliance issue. And then if we think about the cloud, the thing about the cloud is really the only difference if we've implemented our solution correctly, the only difference is that LDAP and AD is kind of off the table now, right? Everything else is pretty much the same. We're using federated auth, we're using SAML, we're using centralized or decentralized provisioning to sort of enable and manage those identities. And we're still leveraging kind of all those same tools that we've built. The strong auth with MFA, centralized audit with correlation ID. So really, if we've sort of built our toolbox correctly, the only difference between an on-prem application and a cloud application, or an on-prem identity and a cloud identity, is that when we talk about cloud applications, we're no longer using LDAP. We're simply relying on our SSO and federation infrastructure to do so. So that's what I have for you today, and I'd like to thank you for kind of thinking through this with me.